Today, we're going to take a look at some of the abiotic factors that make up an ecosystem. Specifically, today we're going to look at climate, and we're also going to learn how to graph climate. So, first, let's just talk generally about ecosystems. So, basically, there are two kinds of factors which can affect ecosystems, and we learn this in our definition of ecosystems. On one side, we have all the living things that make up an ecosystem. We call those the biotic factors. Biotic means living. So the living factors. And we've already learned about those things like our consumers and our producers that are moving energy and matter around the ecosystem, and our decomposers that are helping recycle. And then other things like diseases that might be spreading, and then all sorts of living things, living organisms that have an effect on who lives in that ecosystem. But on the other side, we have our non-living things. We call those our abiotic factors. Abiotic means not living. A means no or not. Biotic means living. So the non-living things control what lives in an ecosystem just as much as the living things. So we have things like the soil, the water, and the air. All of those three things have a big impact on what's living there. Something as simple as dirt versus sand could make a place a forest versus a desert. Same thing with the amount of water. And things like the temperature and the amount of sunlight can control what type of organisms live there. Hot or cold, obviously, has an effect on what organisms live in a place, or the amount of sunlight could control what plants live there. So those are huge factors as to what sort of things live in any given ecosystem. And the biggest one that really controls what organisms and what biomes that you have in certain areas is your climate. And really quick, before we start talking about climate, or one way I could talk about climate is by comparing it to weather. What you need to know about climate and weather is that they both measure the same thing, temperature and precipitation. The difference between an area's climate and an area's weather is that weather versus climate, climate's long term. So when we measure climate, we measure it over the course of a year. We measure averages, and climate's very slow to change. It almost never changes. We compare that to weather, which is what you might get on your TV report, which is short term. It's day to day. It's hour to hour. It's sunny and raining outside. Versus, I might say, well, in the Northeast, it's slightly cool in the autumn. It's cold in the winter. It's warm in the spring and hot in the summer. That's climate. We're talking long term over the course of a year. But we both measure temperature and precipitation, things like rain and waterfall. So they're both measures of the same thing. It's just climate looks at it over long, long periods of time. So like I mentioned, climate measures two things really. It measures temperature, which we just measure in degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit, and precipitation, the amount of rain or water falling from the sky. We usually measure that in inches or centimeters. Usually we do it by leaving a bucket out and just sticking a ruler in it and measuring, how far that bucket kind of fills up. And precipitation can be in the form of rain, hail, snow, sleet, any of those things we consider precipitation. So what we want to do is we want to be able to graph climate, and we call a graph of a climate a climatogram. And basically, since climate is made up of just two factors over the course of a year, temperature and precipitation, a climatogram is just those two factors graphed on the same spreadsheet or illustrated on the same graph, if you will. Pretty easy to do. You can see an example of it here. What we're going to do is we're going to just put our months on the bottom. So the course of a year, January through December, 12 months. Then for every month, we'll be plotting 2 points. We'll be plotting the amount of precipitation and the temperature. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to cheat. Normally, we put our y-axis on the left here. When we make a climatogram, we're actually going to make two y-axes, one for each factor that we're graphing. So for example, we're graphing precipitation. So what I've done over here is on the left-hand side, I made a scale in inches, 0 to 10, for precipitation. And then what I did is we're also graphing temperature. So I used the other side of my graph over here, and I did 0 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so I can graph the temperature using this side of my graph. So if you look for January, we had about 2.5 inches of rain, and the temperature I read from the other side was about 55 degrees, 60 degrees, somewhere around there. So we're using each respective side to graph each respective trait. And the other thing you'll notice is that, and we just do this to illustrate the two and keep them separate, is we graph rainfall or precipitation as a bar graph, and we graph temperature as a line graph. And the way that I tell people to make these graphs when they're making it is just start off with your left-hand side and your months going across and graph precipitation, and then go back and add your temperature scale, and then just regraph a line graph for temperature. And you should have no problem making these graphs. So if it helps a little bit, I've written out these steps here. You can write these steps down if they help you. Just kind of like a cheat sheet to making these climatograms. The first step is just to make a nice title for your graph. An easy way to do that is just write yearly climate of and then stick in the place. And then what you're going to do is you're going to set up your scale here. So the first one, I'm just going to tell you to graph rainfall. Remember, that's a bar graph, and you're going to have it for each month. So the x-axis is your months, all 12 of them. And then your first y-axis on the left is usually going to be centimeters of precipitation. I think for every practice sheet I give you, the amount of precipitation will be in centimeters. And then you're going to go back and graph temperature. So this one's going to be your line graph. Your x-axis is still your 12 months, but your second y-axis on the right is degrees, and normally that'll be degrees in Celsius.